we are in week 3 of our Take a Break series. We're talking about Sabbath and trying to uncover some of the power and the purpose of this principle that God gave to us. Of course, we think of Sabbath as one of the 10 commandments. We'll get there in just a second. But remember, the basic principle of Sabbath is simply this: work 6 days, do something different on the 7th. Now, the pattern might look a little bit different for you. Maybe you work 5 days or 4 days or 3 days or 7 days. But the idea is I work for a set period of time, and then I do something different for a set period of time. And that different looks different. Sometimes it means we're recharging. We talked about that last week, that the only way for us to recharge is to plug into the power source of life, and that's God. So when we plug into His agenda, that's when we really get recharged. But it's also simply about rest. And we're going to talk about that next week. We're going to look at one verse next week, the verse that says, "Be still and know that I am God." And we're going to talk about how that verse can be such a powerful help for us as we figure out how to live out this principle of Sabbath. But today, we're going to look at the Sabbath command. So it's in Exodus 20. We'll get there in a minute. But before we get there, I want to talk to you just briefly about the 10 Commandments. A lot of times when we think about the 10 Commandments, we think, oh, those are God's rules. And He uses those just to keep us under His thumb. And, if we disobey, He's just going to squash us. And maybe you've heard people talk about the Old Testament God and the New Testament God. And how some people say, oh, I love the New Testament God. He's full of grace and mercy and love, and it's Jesus. But the Old Testament God, He's angry and wrathful and violent. I don't really care for Him. That's a terrible misconception of both the Old Testament and of God. In fact, if you read closely in the Old Testament, the God it tells us about is just as gracious, just as merciful, just as loving as the New Testament. Do you know why? Because it's the same God. And God doesn't change. Just sometimes we get our perspective a little out of whack. And so when you think of the 10 Commandments, what I want you to think about is this idea that God's commands are always for our benefit. A loving parent gives commands to their children. We had a command in our house when our kids were growing up: don't cross the sidewalk. Now, there's nothing especially bad about crossing a sidewalk, and that sidewalk was not especially evil. It was just regular concrete, and on the other side of it, there was more grass. And so there really wasn't anything terrible about crossing the sidewalk in and of itself. But what Mary Ann and I both understood, and that Emma and Liam didn't understand, was that just about 12 feet from the sidewalk was the road, and the road was dangerous. There were cars that go back and forth, and they sometimes would come around the corner and not be paying attention. And we didn't want our kids to go on the road because we knew that was a dangerous place for them. So we said, don't cross the sidewalk. Not because we were angry, not because we were wrathful, not because we were violent, not because we wanted to squash them or keep them from having fun, but because we loved them and wanted what was best for them. That's what God does for us. He gives us commands because He loves us and He wants what is best for us. So if you look at the 10 Commands and you begin to understand, these are all actually really good ideas for humanity. Like if we lived in a world where everybody obeyed the 10 Commandments, it would be an awesome place to live. There'd be no killing, there'd be no lying, there'd be no stealing, there'd be no cheating, there'd be respect. It would be a wonderful place to live. But sometimes we say, we want to do it our way, right? And inevitably, when we do it our way instead of God's way, life gets off the rails. So today we're going to look at one of the commandments. We're going to look at the Sabbath command. It's the fourth of the 10. And so if you have your Bible, you can open it to Exodus chapter 20. And we're going to be starting in verse 8. Now, this command is the longest of all of them. God spends the most time explaining the Sabbath command, more than He spends on any of the other commands. So it's definitely worth us taking a look at it. So here we go, verse 8, Exodus 20. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. God begins by saying, remember. And that word does mean don't forget, but it means more than that. It means keep bringing it up, right? Keep coming back to it. Don't neglect it. Make this important. There are dates you want to remember in life. If you're married, you want to remember your anniversary. If you're in a family, you want to remember your family's birthdays. If you're like me, you want to remember what the flavor is right now at the Whip-de-Doo. And for me to remember what the flavor at the Whip-de-Doo is, I have to go back there. And so every time I go back, I remember, and it's great because then I get ice cream also. That's what it means to remember, to keep coming back to. And what God is saying is, I want you to keep coming back to this principle. This isn't something you do once and you're done. It's something you make a part of your life. It's a pattern. It's a principle that you live by. So remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. The word holy actually means set apart, different. So when we talk about the holiness of God, what we're saying is that God is not like us. He is completely different. He is so far beyond us. In fact, God is not like anything in all of creation because he is outside of creation because he is the creator of creation. And so when we think about the absolute best of all of us, God is far beyond that because God is different than us. When we think about the absolute worst of all of us, God is even further from that. God is separate from us. He is different. He is unique. We can never be like him. But he says, remember the Sabbath. Keep it separate. Keep it set apart. Keep it different. What he's saying is there should be times in your life that look different than the rest of your life. So if most of your life is spent working, and for most of us it is, there should be times in your life that look different than that. Times when you rest. Times when you recharge. Times when you focus on him instead of yourself. Remember the Sabbath. 6 days shall you labor and do all your work, but the seventh is the Sabbath. So when we talk about work, sometimes we automatically assume that just means employment, right? So what do I do to work? Well, I'm a pastor. What do you do to work? Well, I'm a plumber. What do you do? I'm an electrician, right? Go on down the list. This is what I do to work. But work goes beyond just employment because the truth is in this room, there are people who are employed and there are people who are not employed. There are people who have retired. There are people who have not started employment yet. And so work goes beyond that. A better way for us to understand work biblically is to think of it as gathering God's provisions. Right, remember when we talked 2 weeks ago about God providing manna for Israel? And the instruction for them was every day you go out and you gather what you need. I've provided it, but you're going to have to work to gather it. Back in the Garden of Eden, before there was even sin in the garden, so everything was still good, God put Adam in the garden. He said, Adam, you're going to work in the garden. I've provided everything you need here, but you're going to have to work to gather it. You see, work is not a curse. Work is not a horrible thing. Work is actually a blessing because it's through work that we gather God's provisions. Now, I know in our day and age, it's hard to think of it that way. But your employment is actually a way for you to gather what God has provided for you. You're like, no, David, actually, my employment is a way for me to gather a paycheck. Yes, I understand that. But then what do you do with that paycheck? You buy what you need. You get your food, you get your groceries, you pay your rent, you pay your mortgage, right? You pay what you need. You see, what you're doing is you're gathering God's provision by working. And so when God says, I want you to work 6 days, what he's saying is, all that stuff you're doing, gather my provision. But then take a day when you do something different. Let's keep going. Verse 11. He says, for in 6 days, the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that is in them. So he's basically taken Genesis 1 and summarized it down into one verse here, right? All that stuff that God made, he made it in 6 days, and he rested on the seventh day. Therefore, the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. So here what we're doing is we're going back to creation, Genesis 1 and 2, and saying, here's the example that God set for you. God worked really hard for 6 days, and then he rested. Now, I didn't always understand this. So growing up, I would think about creation, and I think, man, God must have worked so hard for 6 days. Because look at everything he created. He created the universe and all that is in it. You know, he made mountains, and he made trees, and he made rocks. He made zebras. He made dogs. He made cows. He made lions and tigers, and sin turns them into cats. God did all this work, right? And so he got to the end of day 6, and man, he must have just been exhausted. And so in my mind, God got to day 7, and he was just wiped out from creation, and he kind of just plopped down on the couch, turned on golf, and took a nap. That's what I do on Sundays, right? I plop down on the couch, I don't know, turn on golf, and I like golf, but the reason I turn on golf is it's so soothing, right? I mean, they talk in those low tones. He's got about a 9-iron here. I think he's about 160 yards. And you hear the birds chirping in the background. It's just so peaceful. And I'm just like, so this was my picture of God, working really hard, being exhausted, and needing to rest. But that's not actually what it says, right? I mean, look again at what it said. It says, in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea and all that is in them, and he rested on the 7th. It doesn't say he was tired, because that's not why he rested. God didn't rest because he was tired. God rested because he was done. You see, this is the pattern he wants to give to us. The pattern that he wants to give to us is this pattern of working and finishing and resting. That's the Sabbath pattern. Working, finishing, resting. See, we always think about Sabbath as rest, right? Because it is about Sabbath. The Sabbath principle is about resting and recharging, but it is also about working. In fact, in most of the places we read about Sabbath in the Bible, it also talks about work, because God is teaching us something about work. Work is not a dirty word. It's not an awful thing. It's something that we are to do. We're to work hard, we're to finish, and then we're to rest. Now, this flies in the face of some philosophies a little bit. I love the proverb that talks about a young man who's laying in bed, and it's morning, and he cries out, I can't get out of bed because there might be a lion in the street. Now, that's ridiculous, right? There's no lion. I mean, we think, well, maybe 2,000 years ago there were lions just roaming the streets. No, there weren't, right? It's ridiculous. There's no lion in the street, and yet here we are thinking, well, maybe there's a lion in the street. He's making an excuse. See, he's looking for a reason not to work. And this is one end of the spectrum, is that sometimes we look at work and we say, work is unpleasant, I don't want to work, so I'm not going to work. And then we come up with excuses why I shouldn't work. And those who don't work don't get anything done, right? And if you don't get anything done, it's really hard to rest. Have you ever gone on vacation and been miserable the whole time because you had unfinished work? Or maybe just had a day off, and the whole day you spent thinking about what you should be doing instead of resting because your work wasn't done. You see, that's why God makes a big point of saying Sabbath is about working and finishing and then resting. Don't be lazy, because if you're lazy, you won't finish. Now here's the thing. I know what some of you are thinking, like, David, that sounds great, but I have so much to do, and I work hard, but I have so much to do that I don't have time to rest. And I'm working, I'm not being lazy. Now, see, you are the other end of the spectrum. You've gone all the way to workaholic. See, you got lazy over here, and you got workaholic over here. The lazy person says, I'm not going to do anything because I don't want to work. The workaholic says, I'm not going to rest because I want to work. You see, the reality isn't that you have too much to do, it's that you haven't set your priorities. See, when we set our priorities, what we're doing is we are pre-deciding what is most important in life. And when we pre-decide what is most important, then we know what to say yes to and what to say no to. Did you know that there are times when you get a bad sermon, and it's because you're not my top priority? And some of you are like, well, I'm leaving. I'm done. I thought I was the most important thing in your life, David. Well, you are important. And being up here and teaching you from God's Word, that's a super high priority for me, but it's not my number one priority. It's not even my number 2 or 3 priority. So I had to learn this many, many years ago. I was a youth pastor, and I was busy. I was working hard. I was getting a lot done. I was really good at what I was doing, and I was working like 80 or 90 hours a week. And I was ignoring the more important things, like my family and my faith. And I had to learn, you know what? I've got to change my priorities, because before I can be a pastor, I have to make sure my relationship with Jesus is right. And before I can be a pastor, I have to make sure my relationship with my wife is right. And before I can be a pastor, I have to make sure my relationship with my kids are right. This is prioritizing. So what that means is there are times when I say, this thing at the church has to go undone because it's not my top priority. It's more important that I do this thing with my family. In fact, whenever we hire someone at the church, we have this talk where I explain to them, we choose to cheat here. And that sounds terrible, I know. But in life, you always are choosing what you're going to cheat, right? And because we work at a church, we often have to choose, am I going to cheat the church or am I going to cheat my family? And a lot of pastors get stuck in this trap of, well, I'm going to cheat my family so I can serve the church because that's serving God. And what they miss is that God's first call to them is to serve their family. And so I say to everybody we hire, you have to cheat the church. I expect you at times to cheat the church because you never cheat your family. That's your priority. You see, this is what happens to us. We don't set our priorities, so we don't know what's most important, so we think we have to get everything done, and as a result, we never get everything done, and we never finish, and we never rest. What I have to learn to do is to prioritize by saying, here's what's most important. Now, Jesus made it clear to us. Number one priority, love God. Love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, right? We talked about this in January. And then from there, you have to figure out what's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Faith, family, friends, fitness, future. Can I keep doing this? This is pretty awesome. Finances, career. What's most important? Once you set that stuff in line, now you know what needs to get done and what you can leave undone. And once you know what you can leave undone, now you can say, I worked hard, I finished, and now I can rest. This is the Sabbath principle. The Sabbath principle is work well, work smart, work hard, work focused, so that you can finish and then rest. Now, this is just great advice for life, right? This is just, you should live this way because this is how God created you to live, and you'll experience the best life possible if you live this way. But it's bigger than that, actually. Because part of this command, which makes it unique to most of the commands, is that this command is also teaching us something really important about God and something really important about Jesus. If you skip ahead all the way to the New Testament, you get to the book of Hebrews, and Hebrews is this great book. It's probably a sermon that someone wrote down, and so it kind of reads like that, like somebody's preaching a sermon. And it's this wonderful sermon that someone was preaching or writing to a group of people who didn't have their priorities right. And the whole point of it is you need to prioritize Jesus above everything else. But in the midst of it, there's some really great teaching, and I want to show this to you today. So this is Hebrews chapter 3. And in Hebrews chapter 3, verse 15, it says this, "Today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts as in the rebellion." And I know that doesn't sound anything like what we're talking about. That doesn't sound anything like Sabbath or rest or anything like that. In fact, this sounds a little bit like one of those verses that like an angry preacher would preach, right? Like I'll do my angry preacher impression. "Today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts." Would you guys like it if I preached like that all the time? Yeah? I think probably within 3 weeks I'd be preaching to my wife. And you guys all go somewhere else. So I won't do that. Also, I don't think my voice can handle that. But this isn't angry preacher. This is actually the author of Hebrews telling a story. He's talking about a time in history when Israel rebelled against God because they hardened their hearts. And he explains that in the coming verses. Verse 16. He says, "For who were those who heard and yet rebelled?" So who are these people who hardened their hearts? "Was it not all those who left Egypt led by Moses?" So he said, it was those people, they were slaves in Egypt. God delivered them, brought them out into the wilderness where he provided for them everything they needed. And they're the ones who rebelled. He goes on, he says, "And with whom was he provoked for 40 years? It was, who was it that was just so frustrating for God? Was it not with those who sinned, whose bodies fell in the wilderness?" Again, he's talking about Israel as they left Egypt. And remember how they always grumbled and they always complained, and God was like, how long are you going to do this? How long are you going to disobey me? Verse 18, and to whom did he swear that they would never enter his rest, but to those who were disobedient? So we see that they were unable to enter because of unbelief. All right, so here's what's going on here. He's reminding us of this story of Israel. They're slaves in Egypt. God delivers them miraculously. 10 plagues, parts of the Red Sea, they come out. They walk through the wilderness. And in the wilderness, God provides everything they need. He gives them the 10 commandments, manna from heaven, quail, water from the rock, all that. God provides. And finally, they get to the borders of Canaan, the promised land. This is the land of Palestine. It's where they were destined to go. God had promised to Abraham, to Isaac, to Jacob that their descendants would live in this land, and now here they are on the cusp of entering. And so they sent 12 spies to go in. Go check it out. Tell us what you see. And the spies come back and they say, this land is amazing. It's like a land that's flowing with milk and honey. And in my mind, I'm like seeing some kind of Willy Wonka scene, right? Like literal rivers of milk, like waterfalls of honey. I don't think that's what they meant. But they're saying, this is amazing. It's plentiful. There's more food than we'll ever eat. The grapes are huge. It's unbelievable. And the people are getting excited. All right, this is great. It's the promised land. Finally, we can rest from all of this wandering. And then the spies say, but the people there are fierce and they're huge and we're like grasshoppers compared to them. They will squash us. We can't go in there. And the people start to turn and say, well, let's go somewhere else. We can't go there. We don't want to deal with that. But 2 spies stand up, Joshua and Caleb, and they say, wait. Isn't it God that brought us here? Isn't it God that delivered us from Egypt? Isn't it God that provided for us in the wilderness? Isn't it God who's always done everything we needed? He's always given us everything we needed. Can't we trust him to take this one more step? They're like, come on, guys, let's go. And the people said, no. So God said to Moses, because they don't trust me, because they've disobeyed me, because they're unwilling to enter this land I've prepared for them, this generation will wander in the wilderness until they all die. That's what Hebrews is talking about when it says they all fell in the wilderness. And so for 40 more years, the people of Israel wandered around in the wilderness until the entire generation had died except for 2, Joshua and Caleb. And those 2 led the next generation into the promised land. Now, the reason the author of Hebrews is telling us this story is because he doesn't want us to repeat their mistake. And so he says again, this time in chapter 4, verse 7, today, okay, that word's important because it's like, okay, I'm not telling a history lesson anymore. This is for you right now. Today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts. We've already heard that once, and now we're hearing it again because it's important. What does it mean to harden your heart? To harden your heart means you know something is true, but you don't feel it or you don't want it, and so you reject it and you ignore it and you convince yourself that it's not true. Romans 1 says that all of humanity knows that God exists and that he is to be worshiped, but they harden their hearts. They block out that truth. They willfully ignore it because they don't want to obey him. They don't want to submit to him. And so they harden their hearts against him. And now what the author of Hebrews is saying to us is, when God speaks to you, when he tells you something that you need to know or something that you need to do, when through his word you can hear him talking to your conscience and saying, here's something that needs to change, or here's something you need to add to your life or something you should subtract from your life. Here's something you need to stop doing. Here's something you need to start doing. When you hear God speaking to you, don't harden your heart. Because sometimes, isn't it true that we'll hear the truth of God, but it's hard. It's not comfortable. It's not popular. It's not easy. And we say, if I do that, if I live that way, if I think that way, if I speak that way, if I behave that way, it's going to be too costly. And we harden our hearts because we don't feel it, because we don't want it, because it doesn't feel good. And the author of Hebrews says to us, do not harden your hearts. And then he says this, verse 8. For if Joshua had given them rest, God would not have spoken of another day later on. So then, there remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God. Let me pull this all together. It says, look, Joshua brought the second generation into the promised land. And that was symbolic of Sabbath. You see, the years in the wilderness, that was work. That was the striving. And when it was finished, it was time to rest. And Joshua led the people into the promised land. That was their rest. But here's the point he's making. That wasn't the end of the story, because even after that, God continued to speak of needing another kind of rest. And so Hebrews says there's something even bigger, even better. So at the very lowest level, Sabbath is about, working 6 days, resting one. That's the lowest level. At this secondary level, Sabbath was about the people of Israel, learning that God always provides, He always delivers, and they can trust Him, and they can enter into the land of rest that He has given them if they are willing to do that. But then on this much higher level, there's this idea that Jesus is Sabbath. You see what the author says here? He says, so then, there remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God. For whoever has entered God's rest has also rested from his works as God did from his. All right, God rested from his work. Now, there's two ways to understand that. First of all, we understand it in Genesis, right? Genesis 2, God created for 6 days, and then He rested. That's the Sabbath principle. The beginning of time, God is beginning to teach us this principle: work, finish, rest. Work, finish, rest. All right, so that's one way to understand it. But there is a second time in history when God rested from His work. You see, Jesus came to earth to work for us. He came to earth to do something for us that we could not do for ourselves. In fact, we sang this song just before I started talking. We said, "Oh, praise the one who paid my debt." You see, one of the reasons we work, humanly speaking, is to pay off our debts, right? Maybe it's a mortgage or a car loan or student loans or a credit card loan or a loan from grandpa, whatever it might be. We work so that we can pay off our debts. That's one of the reasons we work. But the reality is that we all have a debt to God that we owe that we cannot pay off. And we work, and we work, and we work to pay that debt. Right? Sometimes we work trying to earn God's approval. I hear people say sometimes, well, I'm not going to go to church because if I stepped inside a church, I'd be zapped with lightning. The place would burn down. Right? And as funny as that sounds, it's actually a really good recognition that God has a standard and I don't meet it. But we would be fools to think that any of us meet it, because all of us fall short. And no matter how hard we work, no matter how much good we do, we fall short of that standard. We cannot clear that debt with God. And so sometimes we turn to other places to try to feel better about that debt. Right? I know I can't clear my debt with God, so maybe if I can gain acceptance among people, maybe that will help to fill some of this emptiness. Maybe if I can do something that feels significant, maybe that will take care of some of this emptiness. Maybe if I try to fix some of the things I've done wrong, and so we work really hard to fix our past, maybe that's going to help with some of this emptiness. And you see, what we're really looking for is fulfillment, because all of us have this sense of, I'm not enough. And it gnaws at us. I'm not enough. I'm not enough. I'm not enough. And we think I'm not enough because I'm not like other people. And we think I'm not enough because I don't have enough. And we think I'm not enough because I don't have the right skill set, or I'm not talented enough, or I think I'm not enough because I haven't done enough. And the truth is, the reason we think we're not enough is because we're not enough. Because we fall short of God's standard. And we know it here, but we've hardened our hearts against it. Jesus came to pay our debt. Jesus came to pay the debt that we could not pay. So here's how he did it. He came and he lived for 33 years and he never sinned. He always lived up to God's standard. He loved exactly as God said he should love. He was merciful exactly as God said he should be merciful. He abstained from everything God said he should abstain from. He hit the marks on every account. And so when Jesus was done, on his account, there was no debt. He owed nothing, which meant he could take our debt and fill his account with our debt. And so when Jesus went to the cross, that's what he did. The Bible tells us that he who knew no sin became sin for us. What does that mean? He took our debt upon himself. Everything we have done, everything we have not done that makes us not enough, Jesus took all of that upon himself. He put it all on his account to pay the price. And as he hung on the cross, shouldering the burden of all of our shortcomings, all of our sin, all of our guilt, all of our regret, it caused him to be separated from his Father, and he cried out, "Why have you forsaken me?" You see, in this moment, Jesus is doing the most difficult work ever done. But you know what's awesome? Is Jesus wasn't lazy. He kept going. And his very last words were, "It is finished." Because Jesus finished what we could not. And when he died, all of our sin died with him. All of our guilt before God died with him. And when he rose again, he demonstrated to all that he had power over sin, he had power over death. And if we will give our lives to him, then we are no longer not enough. He makes us enough. So hear this. If you're spending your life working for the acceptance of others because you think that's what you need to feel enough, it's never going to be done. You're never going to finish. Trust the finished work of Jesus. If you're spending your life chasing fulfillment because you think there's something you can gain or earn or find here on this earth that's going to make you feel enough, that is never going to be finished. But Jesus finished it for you. If you're working so hard that you can't rest because you're chasing significance, right? If I can just get up one more rung on the ladder, if I can just get one more raise, then I'm going to have it all. That chase will never be finished. But Jesus finished it for you. You are enough because Jesus makes you enough. He did the work for you so that you could join him in his work. And so now you're called to something even higher than anything you could imagine. You are now given the opportunity to work with Jesus, to do the work of God, not to gain his acceptance because you have that, but because you want others to know it as well. And so our work is no longer about chasing significance or acceptance or material gains. It's not about any of that. What we want to do is we want to work to bring others into the kingdom. Jesus did for you what you could never do for yourself. Jesus finished for you what would never be done without him. And if you'll give your life to him, you can rest in the confidence that you have the acceptance and that you are enough in the eyes of God. Let's pray.